Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk today, Rethinking Risk Response. Now, the topic of risk response is admittedly old. It's been around since the earliest versions of information risk frameworks, and even longer with risk management frameworks from other fields. We're in a unique time in our field, risk management in general, because of data. Data of all kinds of risks makes new analyses possible. And I think it's time that we revisit the topic of risk response. So today's session will focus on rethinking risk response and moving it from a time consuming chore over to a strategic organizational advantage that helps both teams and leadership allocate resources efficiently. First, just a little bit about me. So my name is Tony Martin Vegue. I'm on the quantitative risk team at Netflix, but I am representing myself in this webinar. All opinions belong to me and not my employer. I am in the cybersecurity field doing cyber risk. And I have to give you all a disclaimer. I'm the first to admit that those of us in cyber risk, our entire field, we are behind the curve. Us cyber risk managers are still in the dark ages, while many Risk Awareness Week attendees, you all are in the enlightenment. And my topic here, risk response, this is a pervasive issue in cyber risk. It might seem quaint to some of you, but hopefully I'll have some tips that are applicable to all. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or comments or want to discuss this talk further. I recommend taking a screenshot of my contact information here up on the screen. So, agenda. We're going to cover a couple of things today. So first of all is why we should care about optimizing risk response. Next is a quick overview of risk response. Then I have 4 strategies that you can take back to your work and implement Monday morning on how to optimize risk response. And last is the conclusion. So this session is based on an ISACA white paper that I wrote and was released back in mid-July of this year, a couple months ago. I was the lead developer and the lead author on this. And through writing this, I learned a lot about how both organizations and different frameworks approach this problem. I found that most frameworks and most individuals actually call this topic risk response, and others call it risk treatment. They are synonymous with each other. I've also realized that there isn't a lot of alignment on the reasons why we manage and respond to risk. And I'm hoping that both this white paper and my session helps with that alignment. So what does optimized risk response mean? It means a couple things. It means we're doing more with less. It also means that response is tied to organizational objectives. I'll get to that in a moment of what I mean by this, but it is not doing risk to say we did risk. You're doing risk because it's going to help your organization achieve its objectives. We are managing, not just mitigating risk. And last, you're helping your organization take the right kinds of risks for the right reasons. And doing these 4 things in cyber risk, this represents a pretty big shift in thinking. It really does. And as I mentioned, a lot of you might find these ideas quaint, but we are just so far behind in this field. Mitigate as the default option isn't always the best option. And I'll cover that in just a moment. So why? Why this talk? Why this white paper? Why do we need to start thinking about optimizing our risk response processes? Why would we want to vertically align risk management up to strategic business objectives and also down to how individual teams are prioritizing their work? And it is because of this, what you see up here on the screen, the security conundrum. If you're not familiar with the word conundrum, conundrum means a difficult or confusing problem or question. And that conundrum is this: the typical security team. We have to start thinking about security in a smart way. a way in which we're intentionally using risk management to solve some of these problems that I have here up on the screen. Some of these problems are we're stretched too thin, we have insufficient resources, we have competing priorities, and there's a very complex threat landscape out there. Optimized risk management and response means that you're moving your risk program away from being a compliance function, something that you do to say you did it, and you're moving it over toward being a true competitive strategic advantage for your company. And that means that your program is producing analyses that directly help leadership answer some of these problems that are here up on the screen. It helps management solve the security conundrum. And hopefully, in turn, it helps the security team become more efficient. So if we know what an optimized risk response program is, what does unoptimized mean? And it's essentially this, what I have here up on the screen. An unoptimized risk response is one that is focused on mitigation only. And I think I'm being too kind when I say the word focused. I think many security teams, I've seen this firsthand, many security teams are obsessed with mitigation. You go out and you use your risk matrix, and you have all your highs, you have all your mediums and all your lows. And the next phase is we're going to turn all of our reds to yellows, all our yellows to greens, and all our greens into some type of risk monitoring situation. And that is not the most efficient response. So let's pause briefly and cover what I mean by risk response. So risk response is the formal process that your organization adopts to decide what to do with risk after it's been identified and assessed. I have the official ISACA definition here up on the screen. I really like this definition. So let's talk about what that means and what some of the risk response options are. So here's a quick overview of some risk response options. So when I was writing the white paper, I took a look at the most common frameworks: ISACA Risk IT, COSO ERM, 2 ISO frameworks, and NIST 839. And I found that all frameworks have the same basic 4 options, which are avoid, accept, share transfer, and mitigate. But ISO 31000 adds a 5th one, which I thought was really interesting, and that is increase risk. And increased risk means you're strategically removing or modifying other response options. And I think this is brilliant that they added that in there, and I wish more frameworks would have this. One thing that binds all the frameworks together is the purpose. All the frameworks that I researched have a stated purpose for risk response, and that's to achieve a business objective. So the purpose of risk response is not to reduce risk. For some people in cyber risk, that might seem counterintuitive, but the purpose isn't to reduce risk, although that is a common outcome. If you think about it, really only 2 things here reduce risk, 2 items. That would be mitigate and share transfer. The other options do something else with risk. And risk response is part of the overall risk management process. This is a concept of the risk management process from ISACA's Risk IT framework. It starts out with setting the context. Then you do your risk identification and assessment processes. You perform a risk analysis. After you have the analysis complete, you move to the risk response process. You choose what to do with risk. From that, you move it to risk reporting and communication. It starts all over again because risk is a continuous process. So I have 5 risk response optimization strategies. We're only going to cover 4 in this session today, the first 4, and that is how risk response works together, aligning to your organization's risk tolerance, efficient risk mitigation, how to effectively transfer risk. The fifth one is strategically increasing risk. I don't have enough time to cover the last one today, but it is in the white papers, and that's why I put it up here. So if you're interested in how to strategically increase risk, please take a look at that white paper, and there's some great tips there. So we're going to start with the first one, risk response, working together. So I don't think of risk response as choosing just one of those options that I had up on the screen a couple slides ago. It's always a case of choosing two or more options, and it's the risk analyst's responsibility to see how they work together and to build that into your analysis. And if you start to frame things that way, you'll see a holistic approach to risk. And you might find, and I found this myself, that you may be mitigating risk unnecessarily. You're wasting your company's resources. And this all ties back to the objective of risk management, which is to align your program to strategic objectives, reduce uncertainty when you're making a decision, and helping leadership find that balance between too much risk and just enough risk. So I want to draw an analogy of how risk response works together, and hopefully that will show you all that you don't choose just one. And I'm going to use driving a car as an analogy. So there are inherent risks with driving. Everybody knows that. Soon as you get behind the wheel of a car, get inside of a car, you are taking on risk. And in this context, risk isn't good or bad. It just is. You're willing to take on that risk to achieve something, to achieve an objective. Go to work, go to school, go do something fun, go see somebody, go to the grocery store. You're willing to take on risk to achieve those objectives. But there is risk involved, so it warrants some level of response. So how would one respond to driving risk? And the solution is easy. You employ several risk response options. You already do this. You might not be thinking about it this way. You can mitigate risk. You can wear a seatbelt, or you can engage in defensive driving. You can avoid certain kinds of risk. You don't ever want to drink while you're driving or drive drunk. And you also want to avoid excessive speed. So that's avoiding some risk. There's some risk that can't be mitigated or avoided. So you're going to transfer that out. You'll transfer that to a third party with auto insurance. And everything that's left over that you haven't mitigated, avoided, or transferred, you're going to accept that. You have to accept a baseline level of risk that isn't mitigated, avoided, or transferred. Now, increase risk. This is always objective based. I can tell you a quick story. I'm a very careful driver. I always drive at the speed limit. I'm really don't take a lot of risk behind the wheel. But when my wife was pregnant, and my son was born, that night when she went to labor, there's just a situation in which I had to get to the hospital very quickly. It was faster for me to drive her because we live pretty close to the hospital than it would be for me to call an ambulance or something. So as the objectives changed, I strategically increased my risk. I drove faster than I usually do. I might have gone through a couple red lights very safely, but I did do that. So to fulfill an objective, you can change your risk. And everything I mentioned here is all bounded by the individual's appetite and tolerance for risk. Everybody's different. Everybody has a different idea of how much they're willing to tolerate for risk when they drive. I drive like a grandpa, as I mentioned. My grandpa, on the other hand, he broke the mold and he was a speed demon. But the funny thing is we both believe that we're safe drivers. So I want you to remember that. How much risk you're willing to take on is psychological. And the same goes with organizations. You have to align your risk, your driving risk, or your information security risk with your objectives, and all that is bounded by your tolerance. All of those things, they all influence how you respond to risk. It all works together. None of those things operate in a vacuum. So the second topic I want to cover is aligning to risk tolerance. It's a great topic to follow the previous one. So I talked earlier that shifting colors around on your risk register is not the best way to optimize the allocation of resources. It certainly doesn't solve the security conundrum. One of the best ways to solve for this is to think about risk in the context of appetite and tolerance. Appetite and tolerance is notoriously hard to wrap a head around. I still have a hard time with this sometimes. But using the driving analogy, appetite is how much risk I'm willing to accept just to drive, just to own a car. Tolerance is the wiggle room around appetite. This shifts with objectives like rushing to the hospital that I mentioned. Capacity is the upper limit of how much risk I'm willing to take on. I don't want to take on so much risk that I end up dead, or I kill someone else, or I end up in jail. If I feel that risk is approaching that limit, I want to start implementing response options. And that's what capacity is. And continuing with this driving example, this analogy, even something as simple as that, when you put it in the context of risk tolerance and overlapping risk response options, you can see where the red, yellow, green paradigm doesn't work. It doesn't provide enough data to make a truly informed, optimized, and efficient decision. I've tried to lay this out here up on the screen. The objective is down the road. This is where we're driving to. This is the direction of travel for you or your organization. Starting with the appetite, these are just general guidelines on how much risk you're willing to take on for all driving trips. So just generally, our appetite is we don't want to get arrested, don't want to kill someone, don't want to go to jail, don't want to get in a wreck. So we're going to stay in our lane and drive safe. Now, tolerance is the amount of acceptable variability from the appetite given an objective. Given that you have to get to the end of the road here, you may need to pass a car or pull into the shoulder or do other things depending on the circumstances. Now, capacity is the maximum amount of risk we're willing to take on. You'll notice that I bracketed the shoulders. We might need to drive into the shoulders to do something, change a wheel or something like that. But we don't want to leave the shoulder because we don't have a 4x4. We don't have an off-roading vehicle. So that could result in serious injury. So that's our capacity. And so understanding all of this in the context of assessing risk of your organization, this is where risk quantification comes in. Risk quantification is, of course, using dollars or your local currency to represent risk instead of colors. Rethinking risk response means you're using risk quantification on some level. It might just be the very highest, most critical risks at your company that pose an existential threat. At the end of this presentation, I do have some resources to get started. But I just want to emphasize that quantification is a big unlock for optimizing risk response. So going with that, let's talk about managing risk on the loss-exceedance curve. So the loss-exceedance curve is a great way to present quantitative risk data to leadership. And I like this graphic. I know it's not perfect. A lot of people don't like loss-exceedance curves or don't think it's right for certain types of risk. But I feel like the benefits outweigh the drawbacks. And the big benefit is many executives have seen this in their chosen field. If they went to MBA school, or if they took a couple finance or economics classes in college, they've seen this. They might know it as a loss curve or an exceedance probability graph, but many executives have seen this, so you don't need to spend time trying to teach them a new way of interpreting data. And we all know that risk isn't a single point, it's a range. And this is an upgrade from risk appetite statements that throw out a single number, like say 50 million. So the red curve represents your company's tolerance for risk. This is essentially how you read it. Look at the blue line. The blue line represents the range of monetary loss associated with this risk analysis. So find 50%. I have a dot there. Find 50%. And this graph tells us that we have a 50% chance of losses exceeding 10 million or more with this risk. The red line represents our tolerance, so we can see that this risk is way outside of our tolerance. We can only tolerate about $12 million of risk at 50%. So you can see that the gap between the risk and the tolerance closes as it gets higher. So what does that tell us? We know that this particular risk isn't necessarily a rare event. It's something that happens quite often. We need to start looking at the causes and get this curve, get this graph down below our tolerance. And this is the big advantage that the LossExceedance curve has. It gives decision makers the ability to decide where on the curve they want to manage risk. So, for example, a risk-averse enterprise might choose to focus response on risk with a 50% probability of losses exceeding 10 million. An enterprise that is risk-seeking, they might want to hold on to some of that capital and cover losses, and manage risk with a 10% probability of losses exceeding 25 million. This type of graphic or analysis, it enables much deeper conversations in the boardroom about risk that represents huge losses for the company, millions of dollars of losses. So with those types of conversations, you can dive into investment strategies, return on investment analysis. This is much more robust than red, yellow, green. Okay, the third topic, making the most of risk mitigation. Okay, so board members and executives should always be asking the CISO, we gave you money last quarter. We gave you $10 million. Where did it go? What did you do with it? So building trust in the analysis means that you're communicating analysis rigor, fidelity. You're building trust with that limited time you have in the boardroom. So this is just an example graphic of data breach mitigation. Boards are always interested in data breach risk. So let's suppose you want to justify spend for bringing the risk down below tolerance. What you're essentially going to do is run 3 risk analyses. You're going to run one risk analysis that measures the baseline of current risk. That is represented by the orange curve. Next is the projected risk with DLP. This is data loss prevention technologies in place. This is the blue curve. You can see that it brings it down quite a bit. Now, let's say we don't have enough money for DLP, or we want to consider an alternative option. This is projected risk reduction with employee background checks and training. And this is represented by the green curve. So you can see that we're running 3 analyses here, one with a baseline and 2 options. And if you know how much both of the options cost, you can do a cost benefit analysis. That gives executives a much better view of where they should be investing their money. They can see it here graphically. This is much better than, hey, I need $10 million to bring this red to a yellow. That shouldn't work. I I think that boards need to demand more. And I believe the time will come when that's just not good enough anymore. So this is how you might be able to mature that process. So this is what you're going to be able to communicate with that type of analysis. Instead of saying we moved a red to a yellow, what you're going to be able to say is your $10 million of investment that you gave me last quarter, it reduced risk by 30 million. And this is an example of how you can have much deeper mitigation analysis conversations with both your immediate teams and executives, including the board. Okay, so the last topic here is effectively transferring risk. So risk transference is one of the mitigation options, and I also think it's probably one of the most misunderstood risk response options. Insurance and contracts. This is a topic that periodically comes up with boards and executives and information security teams. Insurance is a great way to reduce your overall risk, but I think it needs to be done very carefully and with your eyes wide open. Risk transference is not without its pitfalls. Risk managers might know this as share transfer or just simply transfer. And this is where risk is either partially shifted or completely shifted to a third party. And that's the official definition. I think that's a misnomer in our field because it's rare that risk is ever fully transferred. You always retain some level of risk, even if it's just response cost, just general response cost. So we're going to talk about the inability of a third party to accept risk. And you need to be aware of this when you are a huge company and you're asking a much smaller company or firm to take on a huge amount of risk. An example of this would be insurance companies in the 2008 financial crisis. These smaller or relatively smaller insurance companies insured these huge banks. And when these banks started to ask for their policy to be honored, these smaller insurance companies couldn't honor it. It was just too much risk for them that they should have taken on. And a lot of them ended up going bankrupt. So you have to ask yourself, just because a company says they can accept risk, can they? Can risk really be transferred that way? And I have a case study. Hurricane Andrew. This was a hurricane that made landfall in the United States, in the state of Florida, as a Class 5 hurricane. There's only 4 to do so. This was in 1992. There were 65 fatalities, $27.3 billion worth of damage in 1992 dollars. The same type of thing happened here as in the 2008 financial crisis. These insurance companies took on too much risk. They couldn't cover that risk exposure if the worst case scenario happened. Of course, the worst thing happened. 12 insurance companies went out of business as a result of Hurricane Andrew, and it caused congressional action. There was more regulatory oversight over hurricane insurance. So the lesson here is to keep in mind that if a large company contractually obligates a smaller company to cover major losses, it's possible that the smaller company won't be able to pay. And the same thing happens with some types of insurance. So keep that in mind when you're using risk transference as one of your risk response options. And the second topic I want to cover with risk transference is this persistent misconception that all forms of loss are covered with cyber insurance. I have a really quick story I want to tell you. So I was risk analysis in a company a while back. I'm not there anymore, but I did a risk analysis on data breach. And it turned out that just on average, year over year, we were carrying about $80 million in data breach risk exposure. And I brought these figures to our chief risk officer, and he said, well, we have $50 million of cyber insurance. I'm not worried because that means we have $30 million of residual risk. And I know that most of the attendees here will know that that's funny math. You can't subtract your cyber insurance policy with your overall risk because not all forms of loss are covered. So you need to do an insurance analysis with cyber insurance and other types of insurance. This is a quick way of how I do it. These are open, fair 6 forms of loss. And what I do is I just open up my cyber insurance policy or a master service agreement or something like that. I have my fair analysis already performed on that particular event or events that we have insurance coverage for. And I walk through it and figure out if there's a transference gap or not. You can't transfer all of the risk over with cyber insurance. And this is an example of what that would look like with a master service agreement. I have in this column here, I have my losses with a risk analysis and what the current risk is. So this is the result of a risk analysis. We're breaking it out into these rows. With a typical SaaS outage, we're going to see loss revenue, incident response costs, forensics, and management meetings. But coverage in our MSA only covers incident response and repairing and replacing of capital assets. So if the MSA agreement is they'll cover $100,000 of losses, but they list out what types of losses they are, you really need to do this type of gap analysis. You can only do this with quantitative risk. I don't even know how you would do this with red, yellow, green to do this type of analysis with insurance policies. So as I keep mentioning, this is a big unlock using quantitative risk. Really encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't already. Okay, a couple final thoughts. So I know I keep hammering this, but it can't be overstated, especially in the cyber risk field. You have to consider risk quantification, at least for your huge existential risks. Hopefully, you would use it for all of your risks. This is a big strategic unlock. The next final thought is to start thinking about how all of your risk response options work together. You're not choosing just one, you're choosing a couple that work in cooperation with each other. You also want to periodically reevaluate risk to ensure response is still appropriate. And last, you're always implementing KRIs and KPIs to monitor changes in risk. You always want to make sure that your risk response is appropriate and it is tied to strategic objectives. So you want to periodically reassess risk for those things. So here's some resources to get you started. If you're in the cyber risk field, this is a must read. How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. I have the book here because I reference it, nearly every day. So this is a great entry into the field. You also would want to check out a couple ISACA white papers. There's ISACA's Risk IT Framework and the Risk IT Practitioner's Guide. This covers a lot around risk response, tolerance. It is written with risk quantification in mind, so it can help you get started. And then last is the Cyber Risk Quantification White Paper by Jack Freund. Definitely check this one out. It's a great entry point into maturing your risk management program. Okay, well, I really appreciate everybody coming today. I had a great time talking about this topic. Please do let me know if you have any questions or comments. I'm always happy to answer them. And I hope you enjoy the rest of Risk Awareness Week. Thank you. Bye.